I think it is a really interesting and challenging time. Remaining confident but firm in your strategy and keeping calm is one thing.
Your husband was an investment agent as well.
He was. We met at Richard Ellis. It was an office romance. An anecdote was always that people in the market used to joke that we must have a Chinese duvet rather than between us. The thing I don't like about investment brokers is how they just can't resist giving one of their mates a tip off. But you occasionally have to remind people they're not there to run the business. You're there to challenge, hopefully to help the executives, make sure you're acting in the interests of all the stakeholders. Completely confidentially, we are going to need to sell hundreds of millions of property.
Welcome back to the People Property Place podcast. This is the show where I stare at the stories, views, opinions and career journeys of the real estate movers, shakers, innovators and leaders. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Sue Clayton on the podcast today. So Sue, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Nice to be here.
Not at all. Well, look, you've had an amazing career, exec career and non-exec career. And I'm really excited to kind of unpack a little bit about how you've managed to plot and evolve your professional career over the years. But before we get on to some of the non-exec conversations and your input with the boards of Helical, Blue Coast and Segro, can you cast your mind back and tell me a little bit about how and why you got into real estate in the first place?
Yeah, it's obviously quite a long time ago now. So I went to Reading and did estate management. And at the time, I'd heard about property. My dad was a part-time charter surveyor, part-time farmer. Oh. But he worked for the CEGB doing wayleaves for power lines and pylons. So nothing that I was interested in. But I thought if I went and did a real estate degree, I half thought I might like to do law. And I could have then done a law conversion for a year. So I went off to Reading, not knowing much at all. And then from there applied to various firms in London. I was from the Peak District, but realised I wanted to come to London. And applied to a few, got offered a few, and chose the graduate scheme at Richard Ellis, where I then spent, rather unexpectedly, my whole executive career. When I went there, it's because it was an international firm, and I thought, this sounds good. I'm going to be swanning around the world, doing all sorts of things. And 40 years later, I was still in London. So that hadn't quite panned out as expected. But as all good graduates do, you do a rotation. So I did a year in valuation, great grounding, and then moved into fund management, which at the time was a department of Richard Ellis, later was spun out as CBRE Investors as a sort of sister company. And doing fund management was really good experience because you were dealing with asset managers, property managers. You were setting the strategy for the fund. I did some of the buying and selling, but instructed our investment team to do some of that. And after about 5 years, I was thinking, this is quite good fun, but I think maybe I'll look to do something slightly different. And one of the partners in the investment department with whom I was working quite closely said, Sue, why don't you come and be an investment agent? So I did that from 1987 pretty much till I retired, although we can talk in a while about how I kind of eased out of that and took on some more client relationship responsibilities.
So outside of your father, who was part-time farmer, part-time surveyor, but not in the kind of the sphere or space that you ended up in, did you have any friends or contacts or family?
No work experience before I turned up for interviews. No.
And as a kid growing up, what kind of kid were you? What were your kind of strengths and interests?
Very outdoors, because we had a farm. And I spent most of it riding ponies, chasing cows, putting sheep through a sheep dip, which I fell into once. So a lot of time, just outdoors on the farm with my dad.
Particularly academically minded, or?
I think I was quite lucky in that I went to an all-girls boarding school, which was a convent, very strict, not very good academically. So therefore it was fairly easy to shine there without necessarily being that clever. But we were taught great decorum, how to walk around with a book on your head and turn out young ladies and all of that. So I loved it, but it wasn't the best academically.
And how and why did you, so you moved to London obviously, but how and why did you decide to go down the kind of the commercial real estate route? Or was it just off the back of your Reading course? That was the kind of the route and just the next steps?
It was off the back of that course. And it was a big year then. There were about 150 in the year. I'd never thought about it, but when I turned up, there were only about 15 girls. So it was probably 10% girls, which I hadn't really thought about. But that pretty much set us up to do any area of the commercial side. You could choose a rural option, which I didn't, because I didn't want to be an estate manager.
Yeah.
But you did pretty much everything else, lots of landlord and tenant and that sort of thing. So pretty much everyone I knew came to London.
Why do you think you got the call around to pick the story back up? Why do you think you were called and said, look, why don't you come and do some investment agency? What have you demonstrated?
I think quite a commercial outlook. I think that's probably why I remained as a broker rather than went client side. I used to love doing deals. I think if you say hardworking, it sounds a bit cheesy, but I was quite a grafter and just keen to learn more different things. So if I hadn't liked investment agency, maybe I'd have then gone on to try something else. And the partners at Richard Ellis were great. I never really thought of myself as a female investment agent. I just was an investment agent and wanted to be one of the best. And it just grew from there, really.
And just let your deals do the talking.
Yeah.
And what kind of deals were you doing back then?
Well, in the late 80s and early 90s, quite a lot of it was for institutional clients. So we had quite a few in-house pension schemes. So I would buy and sell for them. Some of them were exiting direct property to go into indirect because they were too small to sustain a property investment portfolio of their own. So I would sell some of those either individually or as whole schemes. And gradually more property companies began to buy, and CBRE, or Richard Ellis as it still was, acted for quite a few of them. We acted for some overseas investors who were just starting to come into the market then. And the way I did brokerage, because there are lots of different ways, I think I was more the sort of trusted advisor type rather than, I wasn't down the pub every night as a classic investment broker, gossiping away about who might sell what and that sort of thing. I was much more, I think, discreet and therefore probably trusted a bit more.
So did you have a bit more of a focus on quality rather than just quantity?
Yes, very much so. And in fact, my big break came from actually a female client, and there weren't really other female investment brokers and there weren't many female clients. But my big break came when I got a phone call from somebody at GRE Properties, which was an institution for whom I'd sold a couple of shops for one of her team. And she said, Sue, can you come and see me tomorrow? I want to talk to you about something. So I said, great. And I said, shall I bring whoever, my assistant? No, come on your own. So I went, and she said, completely confidentially, we are going to need to sell hundreds of millions of property. And this was 88, early 89.
So in today's money,
market.
Today's money, a billion and a half
absolutely,
worth of kit.
Yeah. So I sort of said, why? And she said, well, we've got this huge development program, and I've just taken over. She was the deputy fund manager. And she said, and I've realised that actually we're not going to have enough to fund the development programme unless we do some significant selling. What's your view on the market? And I said, well, I think it's at its absolute peak. So why, do you want me to advise on certain properties? And she said, can you look through the whole portfolio, which was over £1 billion, and tell me what I can sell, because it will sell very well, what I should sell, because it's going to be worth considerably less in 2 or 3 years, and how would you approach it? So I said, right. I was a salaried partner then. And she said, and can you come back only to me? And I said, can I involve any of my team or tell Andrew Huntley, who was our sort of boss? No. So I went away and did a load of work and then went back to see her and said, well, this is what I would do. And then we pretty much did that over the next 2-3 years. And she had some other good investment agents who also sold. But at one point I said, well, Michaela, what made you ask me? Because I knew her, but not really well. And she said, I knew you would not leak it. You would not tell anybody. And she said, the thing I don't like about investment brokers is how they just can't resist giving one of their mates a tip off or leaking something or talking about something so they look as if they know more than anyone else. And she said, I know you don't operate like that.
And so she came to you because she just saw the way that you'd operated and conducted yourself and knew that she would have confidence that you'd keep it stum. She could work really closely and take on board your advice and go through the programme of disposing. And did you dispose it before the 91 crash?
Most of it, yeah. But to be fair, because they did need to raise quite a lot of money, we also needed to sell the stuff that you could sell. So some of it she would have preferred probably to hang on to, but it was very prime and we could sell it. But yeah.
And was that a time when your peers, both at Richard Ellis and other firms, kind of looked around and went, Sue Clayton, you kind of really put your stamp in terms of the market, and people kind of woke up to your ability and influence.
Yeah, maybe. I think being one of the very few female investment agents around, I was lucky that everybody knew me pretty much anyway. So if I went to a cocktail party, be it a client one or an investment agent's one, I may be the only woman in the room. So I had the advantage that pretty much lots of people knew me. But yes, I think it certainly at Richard Ellis, I think that kind of showed that they'd been right to back me. And then I got an equity partnership in 93, having had 2 children in 2 successive years just before that. So came back after having them, and that was made one of the 3 last equity partners. There were 24 of us that owned Richard Ellis UK, and I was one of them.
And how old were you at that stage?
Good question. 34.
Wow, amazing.
Actually, no, it must have been 36. Yeah.
So tell me, having kind of come back from a couple of kids, how did you manage being an equity partner of Richard Ellis? High intensity, no doubt, in terms of kind of the work and professional obligations, but also the personal balance as well.
I think I was lucky in that I had a very supportive husband. He was full-time at DTZ, as it was called then. And we had a full-time but not live-in nanny. And we were lucky both the children were fine, and we kind of balanced it between us. So one of us would have to get home to relieve the nanny, quite rightly, and we wanted to see the children. So it worked pretty well as a sort of team effort. And in those days, I don't know if it made it harder or easier, but we obviously didn't have email and all of that. So in a way, when you weren't in the office, you were off duty. And I was very strict at prioritising time spent in the office. And then once I was home, the complete focus was on the family.
And your husband was an investment agent as well.
He was. We met at Richard Ellis. It was an office romance. And then after about a year or so, we kind of thought we probably don't want us both here. And Marcus got approached anyway by DTZ, so he left. But he then ended up doing Central London, and I did national investment. So we didn't overlap too much.
But there must have been some work chat at home.
Yeah, well, an anecdote was always that people in the market used to joke that we must have a Chinese duvet rather than between us. And sometimes colleagues or other people would say to me, what's Marcus doing on this deal? And I'd say, I don't know, you ask him. I'm not going to tell anyway. And also, we don't talk about it all evening. So no, there was life outside investment broking.
How did your kind of career evolve, Richard Ellis, through to CBRE?
So through the 90s, I gradually ended up running national investment, and Stephen Hubbard had moved over to run West End investment. And then in 98, we, as Richard Ellis, merged with St Quintin, from which a colleague, Martin Samworth, emerged, and Michael Brockman emerged, and people that I then spent years with at CBRE. So we became Richard Ellis St Quintin briefly, and I was running national investment. And then Insignia, which was an American brokerage firm from the East Coast, mainly New York, were looking to acquire a mainly UK agency. And to be frank, we needed to raise some outside capital, really, because we realised we really wanted to expand, but we just weren't going to be able. The market was pretty tight. We just weren't going to be able to do that without merging with somebody. So we merged with Insignia and became Insignia Richard Ellis. And then in 2003, another American brokerage firm, CB, bought Insignia. And CB had separately bought Hillier Parker in London. So when they merged, it was effectively us merging the UK business with Hillier Parker in London. And I was head of national investment. A guy called Greg Nicholson ran the investment team at Hillier Parker, who I'd known for many years, a real gentleman. He mainly did retail. I mainly did business space. And he was a bit more experienced. So both of us were very keen to make it work. And so he became the chairman and I became the managing director of UK Capital Markets. Because once the Americans own you, it's all capital markets, it's not investment. And actually that worked really well because we had a couple of people. Because if you're merging two big London firms, whoever's running whichever department clearly wants to run the enlarged merged one. So some people fell out big time, and we did lose a couple of people on each side because they just threw their toys out of the pram when they weren't going to be leading it anymore. Greg and I reached a very amicable and sensible way of working together.
Two investment agents negotiating your own path. Is that where through these mergers, because you're obviously an equity partner, did you personally make some good money along the way?
Yes, when Insignia bought the Richard Ellis UK partnership,
that was a good opportunity to take some cash off the table effectively.
And then after that, we were all employees. So then you were called an executive director, but you were an employee. As you'd expect, when being acquired, they tie you in with share options because the last thing they'd have wanted is for us all to
walk out the door and set up a competing business.
Exactly. So we were tied in for sort of 3 years and pretty strong golden handcuffs. And some people at the end of that retired or went off somewhere else, but the majority stayed. But what I always really liked about it, and if you look at CBRE now, I mean, it's just the most amazing global business. What I really liked was it still had that core Richard Ellis culture and feel to it that we'd had since I'd joined however many years before, at the beginning of the 80s. Somehow that stayed strongly through. And then people like Martin Samworth and Michael Brockman, who'd come with St. Quintin, we just managed to keep, and we brought Dalgleish. So obviously we then had Malcolm, we had Kieran, who runs it now. Somehow we managed to just keep that Richard Ellis spirit.
How did you manage the two sides of your professional career? One is, being an investment agent and doing deals, and the other is the man management and kind of leadership aspect.
Yeah, I actually really enjoyed both. Some people are just out and out deal doers, way better than me, I'm sure, and didn't like any of that. I found the leadership and people side really interesting. And I think different leaders show different attributes. But if you have lots of empathy, interest in people, genuinely interested in people, not just money, I think it can bring out your strengths, really. And so I liked the combination of both of those. Occasionally you see where somebody gets promoted because they're the best investment agent and they're a lousy people manager. I think what we did quite well at now CBRE was recognise who was good at which bits. So when we then acquired, for example, Holly Blake, so Simon Blake, who I'd done deals with over many years, became a colleague, still there now. Or Frank Warwick. Franco joined us again. I'd done deals with Franco for goodness knows how many years by then, 25 years. What we were able to do was let them carry on doing deals.
You didn't try and turn them into anything else?
No, and they didn't want to be running huge departments and spending a lot of time on all the HR side of it and all of that. So I think it's always a balance, that, but I think we managed that quite well. And I liked...
You lent into it naturally.
Yeah.
And you got some kind of good support in terms of like training or courses?
Yeah, very much so. And then, so I ended up on the, if you led a department, you were on the sort of management board. And then I ended up on the executive board, which was a smaller group. Then on the strategy board, which was different again. And I ended up on the CBRE group board, which is our board. I've been out of CBRE for 5 years, but it's like a stick of rock. I think it still runs through me. I was lucky enough to be invited to go onto the CBRE group board, the first European to do that, which meant going to Los Angeles every 3 months.
And so that was a company-wide global board?
Yeah. So that was really interesting.
Made up of how many people?
About 10. Of which 3 or 4 were sort of executives, and then they had 4 or 5 not genuine non-execs. But if you're quoted in the US, the regulatory side is pretty heavy. So my role was described as the employee director observer. And they'd always had an American in that role, and it was usually somebody who ran a big piece of the American business, which was good in a way because you didn't have the public liability that being a director of a US company carries. Yeah. So it was described as a director observer. It was supposed to be for a year, but they extended it for 2, and that was interesting. The board meetings were not very exciting, very structured, dealing with lots of governance and procedural stuff. But there would be 2 days before that, talking about the really meaty stuff. So that was good.
And did you remain on the tools in terms of doing acquisitions and disposals for select clients? And how did you decide what you picked and chose? Was it normally about the size and the fee level? Is that what dictated it? Or?
Well, I was always somebody who had a bit more than a handful, but a number of very good client relationships. Sort of not just a fair weather friend, but people with whom I'd worked through good markets and bad. So I pretty much stuck with all of those. And in fact, Slough Estates was one of those, now Segro, and now I'm a non-exec. Federated Hermes, or Hermes as it had been then, I did some work there with the late Chris Darroch. And then later went on to one of their property unit trust boards. So I kind of dealt with clients that I knew very well. Brixton was another one, which then was acquired by Slough Estates, now Segro. And I worked, by then I'd pretty much worked out I only wanted to work with people that I knew and liked.
Yeah.
I found life was too short to want to deal with people that weren't probably going to respect me or I didn't want to work with. So I didn't.
And I'm sure there are a fair few of those, just in terms of the ego and the bravado that sometimes that you can find in the world of investment. You know, it's the big fee generating part of the business typically, and it can be very competitive, and it can sometimes be quite hard.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you
kind of try and get people to, lined up and all rooting in the same direction, because there's individual incentives. But it's trying to balance that with the wider collective as well. Yeah,
it was interesting. As I say, there are all different styles of investment brokerage. And I found that I did deals with fellow investment agents, again, who I knew well. So Franco, Phil Marsden, Simon Blake, people like that. And client-wise, between us, sometimes one of us would be acting for the vendor and one of the others for the purchaser. And so I probably dealt with a smaller group. And within our teams, we had a range of good brokers. And again, some of those had different strengths and different client relationships. Some were better with the international clients. Some were better with some of the smaller property companies. Some of the big egos at the clients, when you actually gave them good advice, were very appreciative. So Gerald Ronson, for example, where my boss of the investment department in the late 80s was Andrew Huntley, and he had a brilliant relationship with Gerald. And then when Andrew stepped away from investment brokerage, Stephen Hubbard took it over. And I didn't get involved much, but if it was a sort of national investment portfolio type deal, I would go and see Gerald. And he had a reputation as being pretty tricky, and especially with agents. So somebody had said to me in advance, just don't bullshit. You won't anyway, Sue, because that's not your style, but don't bullshit. So I went in very well prepared, and he's running through a portfolio, probably 10 properties on a page, 5 or 6 pages, flicking through my numbers and description and yields. And he always called me Miss Clayton. So, Miss Clayton, what about this shop in Blackpool? What rent have you got on that? And I'd say, this. And what do you reckon that's worth? This. And why? And then he'd flick to another one. And I mean, he was so on the detail. He was amazing. And he knew all the rents. He'd been to see them all. So you couldn't possibly, I'd been to see them all, but you couldn't possibly pretend that you knew something you didn't. Anyway, apparently afterwards, he said to Andrew Huntley, that Miss Clayton, she's all right. You can bring her again. Whereas some of my colleagues had said, oh, I feel so sorry for you, going there. He's going to throw you out. Yeah,
because that's exactly what happened to them.
Yeah, so no bullshit, I think.
What makes a good investment agent, if you can try and boil it down to a few things? Because obviously you touched on there's a few different styles.
I think sort of business nous. I think knowledge of the detail. And you have to put the graft in. Ideally you've been to see it. You're not just sort of looking at a screen, pretending that you know something you don't. Because I'd done fund management, I had had really good experience of what delivers performance, and therefore would look at future returns and I think really understand that. Whereas without that background, I might not have got that.
As well as your valuation background, I guess, in terms of the drivers that move that.
Absolutely. And I think working with some really smart clients and seeing how they approached it. Also telling clients when not to do a deal. I know one of your podcast guests has been Simon Cook, and when he and Richard Cundall were at Morgan Grenfell Asset Management, I was looking at a pension scheme that was selling, looking at a portfolio for them. And we'd done a lot of the work. We were getting close to when it would exchange. And I went to see them and said, I don't think you should do this. And Richard Cundall said, I'm glad you said that, Sue, because I was going to call you in and go, are you absolutely sure this is prime, very expensive? And it was 1988, I think. And I said, yeah, I don't think you should do it. And he said, well, good on you, because a lot of agents would realise they're going to lose a fee.
I was going to say...
He said, if you'd said do it, I wouldn't have done it anyway. But good on you for telling me that.
So you kind of put yourself in... You kind of took the long-term view rather than the short-term transaction.
Yeah.
And is that a theme that you kind of carried throughout your career in terms of doing the right thing at the right time and giving best and proper advice, even if it meant that short-term you'd done yourself out of a fee?
Yeah, very much so, which is why I think I had the longevity of client relationships. And, I mean, you need to look at the bigger picture. You might be thinking this year's bonus fee now, but that's going to be quite short-lived, I think, if you give people some bad advice.
Property is a people business, hence the name People Property Place. Business has been tough the last couple of years. Get the people aspect wrong, business becomes impossible. Get the people aspect right, it's still hard, but it's manageable, much more enjoyable, and you're much more likely to hit your goals. So if you're looking to add top talent to your team in 2025 and you're open-minded to an alternative approach and you're keen to make business a little less hard, drop me a DM. I'd love to have a conversation with you to see how Rockborn could potentially help you with your human capital requirements. Right, let's get back to the podcast. In terms of the board experience, was it the internal boards at CBRE that gave you a taste for your kind of non-exec career?
I think they gave me some experience for it. At the time, I didn't really think of it as starting a taste for it. My non-exec stuff started, I think, 17 years ago. A headhunter that I knew then a bit, because I'd met him at the odd golf day, rang me and said, Sue, I know you don't do any non-execs, but I've got a role that you might be quite interested in. So at the time, they were called UK and European, which is the Lewis family. So it's a private family office. They wanted Clive Lewis wanted an advisor on quite a light touch basis, but to give advice on the UK market. And then they subsequently got another colleague to come onto the European side. And so I wasn't really looking for anything, but and he said, you'll really like Clive Lewis, and they are a great group to work with. So I went to meet Clive, and obviously initially thought I need to make sure there's not a conflict of interest here. But at that point as well, I was just starting to move away from the brokerage side, more into the leadership side, and also then client relationship side. So agreed with Mike Strong that there wouldn't be a conflict. And if ever there was a conflict, obviously I would declare it. And became it's now called a senior advisor, but became an advisor to them. And 17 years later, they're now called Blue Coast Capital. I still advise on the UK. A guy that actually, to show what a small world it is, for about 14 or 15 years of that, a guy called Rob Orr, who ran JLL Europe and had been based in Germany for a long time. He was brought in to advise on the European portfolio. And he and I used to live in a house in Wimbledon together many years ago.
So it's still a small industry now, even smaller back then. And the Blue Coast Capital, they made their money through retailing, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And River Island, I
yes,
think is
Bernard Lewis was a retailer. It was called Chelsea Girl. Not many of your listeners will remember Chelsea Girl, but I think I do. It was a high street retailer in the 70s and 80s. And now River Island. So they'd made their money in retail, but gradually had gone more into property investment. And they invest across Europe, the US. So I work with a colleague there. And the UK, and it's over $1 billion, and they've been great people to work with ever
privately
since.
Owned,
yeah.
Family office type.
Yeah.
So you cleared the potential conflict internally with CBRE, and that was your
Yes.
first kind of senior advisor role. And what were some of the kind of the lessons, or what were the things that you had to kind of learn in order to transition or get brought up to speed to be able to take on an external advisory role? Because in my day-to-day job as a headhunter, I talk to a lot of people who are probably in a similar stage, who are, have got a great career, but they're just thinking, right, actually, I want to be an external advisor, or think about taking a seat on a board. What are the things that you would advise them to look out for, or be minded to learn to add some value?
Yeah, I think I was lucky because I was always approached rather than setting out thinking, I want some of these roles, how am I going to find them? But I think I'd had quite a broad investment experience. So although I latterly was specialising in business space, so industrial and office, over the years I'd done all sorts of investment. And so having that broader perspective, I think, is important, because depending on which board you're going on to, it might not be a specialist REIT that does the exact sector that you do. And a couple of the portfolios that I've been part of, they've invested across all sectors. I think, particularly as a non-exec, the ability to think strategically is really important. And you have to recognise you're not there to run the business. I've been involved in recruiting other non-execs on 3 of the 5 boards that I've sat on. And some people are better at it than others, but you occasionally have to remind people they're not there to run the business. You're there to challenge, hopefully to help the executives make sure you're acting in the interest of all the stakeholders, which could be the employees, could be the shareholders, but mainly just to get that strategic lens on it. And again, not too short term. And some people find that easier than others, I think.
And did you find it difficult, or did you find it relatively easy, given the fact that you were an advisor kind of throughout your career? You just had to tap into a slightly different set of questions and a little bit of a different viewpoint, sat at a senior advisory or non-exec table compared to the brokerage table?
I didn't find it too difficult. What's interesting is that what you learn at one board table is often useful at another board, even though it may seem completely different. And I'm still learning stuff now, which is why it's so enjoyable. You also get the benefit of hearing from lots of experts who are brought in on different aspects. I think occasionally when I was looking at a board position, it's been, in some cases, that they wanted somebody who'd had a principal background. And I get that. So when I joined the board of Seagrove, for example, they typically had 2 property experts, and the rest of the non-execs bring other skills and experience. And when I joined Seagrove, they had Martin Moore, who had run Prupim, then M&G Real Estate. And so they really wanted somebody who had an advisory background as well. So I joined 3 years after Martin, but that worked quite well. And then when Martin retired, when we went to recruit another non-exec, actually we wanted somebody who had been a principal. So we brought Marcus Sperber on last year.
He's got quite the board career as well.
Yes. So he came on last year. So sometimes I think maybe they need somebody who's been a principal. In other cases, maybe having that advisory and broader background seems to work as well.
What's the criteria or the lens at which you decide whether you want to join a board or not?
I've been lucky in that in virtually every case I knew the people, and I really want to work with people that I trust and respect and actually have a real interest in the outcome. It's not just being there for the sake of it. So for me as well, it's a balance of time spent on paid roles, plus we can talk about some of my other roles in a minute. I don't want to spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week on all these non-exec roles. So I am highly selective.
Yeah, it's not an ego play for you just to say, look what I'm doing.
Not at all.
It's very much a project it's a person-driven decision, but also the project's got to be intellectually and stimulating
and
as well.
something I really believe in. I think as well, if you're going to be a non-exec of a publicly quoted company, there's quite a lot of responsibility comes with that.
And there's a lot of pressure as well. A lot of people don't want to put themselves in the firing line potentially by doing that.
No, when I was first approached to go onto the Helical board, and I'd known Mike Slade for many years, initially I sort of thought, no, I don't think so. I'd never contemplated wanting to go onto a publicly quoted company board. So initially thought, don't think so, but then got persuaded that I did know them well, and it's quite small cap, and they're very good on governance and the regulatory stuff. So that was my first quoted one. But yes, it's not to be rushed into. And I've stuck with real estate. I've stuck where my role is really bringing that investment experience to it.
In terms of what, market cycle or, portfolio rationalisation?
I think all sorts of things, really.
And has that kind of stayed true throughout, in terms of the lens at which or how you contribute to a particular board is within certain parameters, or is that kind of evolved over time?
It's evolved over time, and depending what's happening both in the market, what crises we've hit at which moment, but also there will be events within the company, either in people terms or potential mergers or other things that crop up. So again, you go into it, I think, needing to know what you're taking on and being prepared at different times to put in quite a lot more work, depending what's going on.
How much work does go into being on a board? And that's probably quite an open-ended question because it depends on cycle and time and transition and what you're signing up for. But how much work kind of goes into board meetings and the cadence and the regularity of that, but also the pre-work and the post-work?
It varies depending on what it is. On the two FTSE boards that I'm on, we would probably say it's 20 days a year or whatever. But actually, I'm somebody who always does the reading and does some other stuff outside to sort of check things. And on the Helical side, I chair the valuations committee, as we call it. So I go and see the assets twice a year before we have a meeting with the valuers. So it varies, but people often say, well, how many days a week does it end up? But it does vary. There are certain months also when it's very busy. So with SEGRO, we have 2 sessions a year where we go to some of the offices. So we're off to Germany in the summer. We went to Slough Trading Estate. There's a strategy day just before the board meeting, and there are asset tours. So it varies. I really like getting out to see the assets because that's my background.
That's your background, and I guess that gives you confidence in terms of the advice you're giving, having kind of got a whole picture of the portfolio and where it starts and stops. You mentioned earlier you sit on a couple of boards that aren't they're maybe within real estate, but they're not maybe financially geared or paid positions. Can you just talk to me about those positions and how and why you got into those?
Yes, well, over the years, different things have cropped up. So I was a trustee of the Reading Real Estate Foundation and one of the original people who sort of helped set that up. And from that spun out Pathways to Property, which helps promote social mobility within real estate in an effort to try and offer it as an opportunity, as a career to children who would never otherwise get that chance. So Pathways to Property, which Paddy Allen runs, has a summer school every year. We get over 100 students coming to that, and they hear about a career in real estate and hopefully may study it at Reading, may do an apprenticeship, may go somewhere else. So the point of the foundation, when it was first set up, was to also help students at Reading get work experience, have mentors, make sure they had the best opportunity for a job at the end of 3 years, or 1 year if it's a master's, at Reading. But with that broader plan, we also raised money for scholarships, hardship, grants, bursaries, to help get somebody through university if they otherwise couldn't afford it.
It's an amazing charity, and Paddy does a great job with it. And
Yes.
we were actually really fortunate. I don't know if you know, but we put 3 new advisory board members in within the last 6 months.
Brilliant.
So it was really oversubscribed. So an amazing uptick in terms of people that wanted to get involved. And they've got 3 absolute rock stars who've joined them, and I've seen they've done their first board meeting. And there's a lot of other people invited along to the summer school and who are quite keen to get involved with helping out. So big fan of Paddy and what he and the wider board are doing there.
Yeah. So Pathways came out of, as I say, the Reading Real Estate Foundation, which still is the sort of owner of the Pathways project. And then it's not a charity, but about 10 years ago, having known a few senior women, a couple of lawyers, one banker, one fund manager, across the market for quite a while, people used to ask me what we were doing at CBRE, because I'd founded the CBRE Women's Network in the UK in 2005. And at that time, that sort of thing didn't really exist here. And it wasn't done as any sort of effort to claim that we were all downtrodden and men bashing, but it was to really promote and make sure that women at CBRE felt as supported as they could be. Sometimes after returning from maternity leave, in other ways to make sure that they were promoted and just could thrive in their career at CBRE. So that's why I set that up. And then a few years later, as I say, some of these senior contacts would say, I hear you've got this, Sue. What are you doing? I'm at a law firm and we've got very few equity partners who are female. What can I learn? What's best practice? So a few of us had spoken to each other over a couple of years, and then we decided if we joined forces, could we really move the dial on getting more women, it was initially, into senior positions? Because when I looked over my shoulder, where were all the women behind me? So we established it with the help of a lot of senior men in the industry. Because what we did realise is there's no point women sitting just talking to women. You need to involve senior leadership. And between us, we had really good contacts. So we founded Real Estate Balance, which was a bit of a sort of kitchen table enterprise initially, because we were all working away, and got the support of some really great leaders, some of the chief execs of some of the brokerage firms. So CBRE were great, quite a few what were then my client firms. And it sort of spun from there. And after a year or so, we realised if we were going to do it properly, we needed to get some funding. And again, some of those early supporters gave us money, and then we were able to set up something more formal and charge members an annual fee. And now, nearly 10 years later, Sue Brown is our managing director now, who, again, I'd known a very long time. It's just brilliant. I mean, I like to think it's the leading DE&I, diversity, equality and inclusion firm in the real estate industry, and that we are making a real difference. But that's because of the support of those, some of the early, but now a much broader number of CEOs.
Who have helped kind of get it off the ground, invested in it, opened it up and encouraged people to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we're not just focused on gender diversity. We're also focused on ethnicity and social mobility.
Really obvious question. Why is that so important?
I think I've found that our industry can have a huge impact both on sort of communities, on the people that work within it. And it's such a great industry to work in that I found that it was such a shame that so few people knew about it. And talking about women in particular, a lot of really talented, keen women, for whatever reason, were not being retained within the industry. So whether it was at law firms where they would be 50-50 on intake at the outset, and yet when it came to partnership, they were less than 10%. At CBRE, we still lacked really senior women. And so it was really an effort to see, well, why is that? Why can't we create careers that everyone can thrive in? And some of it is internal to the firms and their policies. Some of it actually is what's happening in people's lives. And there isn't anything you can do about that apart from make sure you've got the best policies in place, offer flexibility where it's needed. And if you're good to employees, they are really loyal, I think. And if people can't retain their staff, it doesn't matter how good your business is, but people are our only assets at an advisory firm. So if you can't retain them, something's going seriously wrong. So that was really why we founded it, to try and attract more people to the industry, but also just make sure that those within it could thrive.
There's one thing having the kind of the policy in place. The other thing is the culture and the implementation and execution of it. What advice would you give to a firm who's trying to work out and tread the fine line between policy and practical implementation and culture?
I think join Real Estate Balance if they are not already, as we really can demonstrate best practice and use lots of case studies, and member firms can support other member firms to improve. You're right, it is one thing having the policy, but if the culture is not supportive of that, it's a waste of effort. Gradually, I think firms are realising this and tackling cultural behaviours. So whether that's calling out bad behaviours, whether it's not promoting people who don't demonstrate that inclusive culture, or whether it's, when looking at bonuses, determining them not just on fee revenues, but on overall team leadership, the culture within the area of the business that they are, what are their retention rates, are they losing lots of staff? And I think if people's pockets are affected by that, they do sit up and take notice. And I think I've seen in some of the firms that some of the sort of old dinosaur type, as I would have seen them and in some cases grown up with, those people actually are no longer the leaders of the business. And I think it's recognised that that attitude is like a dinosaur, and at some point they will be extinct. So that's a bit of a glib answer, and it's really important that firms do work on the culture. The pandemic actually helped around flexible working, I think, and many more working dads, I think, now feel that they can say, actually, tomorrow I'm doing nursery drop-off, so I won't be in till 9:15 or whatever it might be, without that fear that they're going to look, I don't know, as if they're less keen. And some of the companies I'm involved with shared parental leave, again, we encourage men to take some months out to spend with their babies in that first 12 months.
Real estate is going through a massive transition right now, and no doubt you'd have seen a few changes in market cycles during your period, whether it's geopolitical, cost of materials when it comes to development, the prevalence of kind of alternatives, infrastructure capital kind of entering into the real estate space, uncertainty. It's almost like a never-ending list, and a lot of people that I'm talking to are kind of saying, they're keen to get on with it, but there's a reason not to, and there's a cautiousness. What advice, and what are you hearing in terms of the conversations that you're having with the execs and senior leaders in terms of their take on the market and what to do now?
I think it is a really interesting and challenging time. One advantage of having seen quite a few cycles through at my age, I think, is you have had the experience of seeing things coming out the other side. You can imagine on the board tables that I'm sitting around at the moment, everything you've listed is right up there. What do we do now? I think remaining confident but firm in your strategy and keeping calm is one thing. I don't think you want any knee-jerk reactions, especially with the sort of tumultuous time we've had over the last 2 or 3 weeks.
With the Trump tariffs.
Exactly. So no knee-jerk reactions, but just the ability to sort of see through of that. And if you've got a good business and a sound balance sheet, sometimes it's important to be a little more patient. Maybe whatever your plan was for this year may have to be put out a bit. But I think out of difficult times comes opportunity. And for those well-capitalised firms and people who are picking up on the sort of, I prefer to look at structural trends in markets and a thematic approach to investment rather than just cyclical. And so if you've picked, I think, the right sectors, you can ride through some of this and there will undoubtedly be opportunities.
And what are some of those thematics or wider themes?
You'd say I probably would say it, wouldn't I? But I think urban industrial, sort of big box logistics, anything to do with AI, which benefits data centers, some of our logistical stuff anyway. I think there are good opportunities there, so I'm a fan of that. On something like offices, which actually a lot of people are steering very clear of, I do think now there's been such a repricing, and as long as you've got best-in-class, good, sustainable buildings, I think there are good opportunities there. So on Helical, for example, we're finding the occupational tenant demand for certainly Helical schemes, and we can see it on other top-class schemes in London. There is actually really good tenant demand. We're seeing pre-lets, we're seeing forward sales, and no shortage of occupiers for the best buildings. So I am a fan of offices, even though some people think the whole sector is doomed. Also, the whole living space, which I'm sure you've had people on here who are much more expert than me. But if you look at real estate as what people actually need, you need to create space for living, for student. And so I do think there are opportunities there. Retail's been through a really tough time. I know less about retail anyway. At the moment, I can see there are opportunities, but I haven't quite got my head round all of that.
Yeah, I think the kind of the specialists that I talk to in the retail space are quite looking forward to this next kind of period through the worst. And yeah, they're quite excited about retail's kind of wider prospects. But again, I think it probably comes back to the fundamentals of quality of location, quality of kit, and clearly the price you paid for it, which will have a determining factor on how successful you fundamentally are. What are you most excited about right now as you cast your eye forward?
In the market or my own life?
Give me both.
In my own life, my daughter's having a baby in a couple of weeks. So that's going to be very exciting.
Does that make you a grandmother for the first time?
Yes, yeah, which is going to be very exciting.
New portfolio career?
Yeah. In the markets, it's been a challenging, difficult time. And luckily, the companies I'm involved with are very sound. And we do see this actually as an area of opportunity. We're not under pressure in terms of having to sell or raise money at a bad time in the market. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of opportunity. And so I think whilst we're cautious right now, I think there's a good degree of optimism about the next 12, 18 months.
You touched on earlier your first board appointment externally was with Blue Coast Capital. How did you transition away from an executive career at CBRE into a kind of a portfolio and a non-exec career?
It came about partly because I'd decided that having done investment agency for so long, I actually wanted to do something a bit broader. And got good succession plans in place. And I had always been very strong on certain client relationships. And at the time at CBRE, we needed somebody to step perhaps a little bit away from the coalface of deals and start to run some of those big client relationships. So CBRE Investors was by then a separate company, but owned by the same parent. And I was asked if I would take over the running of that relationship, not just from an investment point of view, but on behalf of the whole firm. It was one of our biggest clients, but not the biggest. And there was always a certain tension when the American parent thought that we should be doing much more business between us. And yet they, as fund managers, wanted to use whichever agent they thought was best. And we, as advisors, didn't want to be tied to them all the time. So I got involved on that. And at one point, a guy I knew well, Giles King, who'd been a good client of mine, running the Strategic Partners funds there, became the managing director of CBRE Investors. So actually, it was easy for me to start to work with Giles to try and build that relationship to make it even stronger. And then gradually we realised that that sort of model worked quite well. So I was doing less dealing again by then and took over the relationship with something like M&G, which was with Martin Moore at that point, and then with Alex Jeffrey, who ran M&G. So again, I was there to sort of maximise the business, but also make sure that all the areas of the firm were working well. So it was a little bit sitting around a smaller board table with them. And then I decided I wanted to work a bit more part-time and dropped a day a week. And at that point, Helical approached me about being a non-exec there. Again, had to make sure that CBRE were happy, there were no conflicts. And gradually I ended up doing 3 days a week. And by then, Federated Hermes had asked me to join the board of their property unit trust. And so I ended up with, finally at CBRE, I think, doing 9 or 10 days a month, running a couple of the big client relationships and doing these other non-execs. So I would say I was lucky because CBRE were brilliant at keeping me still within there, but actually giving me the rope to go out and start to do some of those other roles. And so then when I finally left CBRE, after
they let you go.
They let
eventually,
me go.
Or you,
yes.
You know, each time you went to resign, they kind of kept you or renegotiated your working arrangements.
Yeah.
Kieran finally said, you can go with our blessing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'd already been doing some of those roles for 4 or 5 years. So actually it was a brilliant way of exiting a full-on executive career very gradually and then having those roles in place.
And giving you time to play golf and pursue other personal interests.
Do my charity stuff, yeah. I've been at the food bank today. I volunteer at a food bank. So I was there this morning before I came to see you.
Well, look, Sue, you've had an amazing career. It's been a real privilege to sit down and ask you some questions about how you've navigated it, some of the lessons and views. A question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, if I gave you £500 million worth of capital, how would you allocate it?
If I was lucky enough to be in that position, I think I would recognise that there would be people better than me to actually invest it. So I would probably try and split it between some very good people. I've always admired some of the big names that we've seen across real estate, but people like Nick Leslau, Mark Gilbard, I think there are some very smart people. So I would probably give a chunk of it to them to manage. Being on the board of a couple of REITs, shares are at a big discount.
30%?
And the rest in some cases. Public markets often rebound quickly when the opportunity genuinely exists. And so I might put some money into some of the REITs because they are at such big discounts. And also, I think if I could put an element, a part of it into something like a sort of social impact fund or something that actually would make a difference to people, then I would want to do that.
What advice would you give yourself when you left Reading University and pursued your first, or kind of did your first day at Richard Ellis way back when? What advice would you give yourself then, what you know, knowing what you kind of know now?
I think be open to any opportunity and be confident that actually if you are given that opportunity, go and do it. Maybe think what's the worst that can happen, because I think sometimes, and it does sometimes particularly apply to women, I think people lack a bit of confidence and don't necessarily realise their own ability. So I think be confident, take opportunities that you're given, always work hard and show huge enthusiasm, and be good to people. We were talking earlier that you never know who you're going to sit around a table with or one day want to do a deal with. So actually, if you've created a pretty good reputation in the marketplace for dealing straightforwardly and well with people, I think that's of benefit.
So, like I said, amazing career and real privilege to sit down with you today. So thank you so much for joining and imparting and sharing so much wisdom.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, quick one from me. If you enjoyed this conversation, do me a favour and share it with a friend or colleague that you think would get value from this conversation. It would mean the world and help grow the People Property Place podcast. Thank you so much.